Hi everyone, and welcome to the CoastWA Training module on vulnerability analysis and risk evaluation. My name is Clint Doak from MP Rogers and Associates, and I'll be taking you through this process today. First of all, I'd just like to give a run through of the previous training modules that you can find on CoastWA. They are important in that they provide, a bit of context to the work that we're going to see and pick up on today. So there's one on coastal processes, there's coastal protection works, benefit distribution analysis, and then probably most importantly, there's the coastal hazard assessments. And I guess I say most importantly because in this vulnerability analysis and risk evaluation, we're going to use the coastal hazard assessments to actually assess the vulnerability and risks to assets. So we will do a little bit of a recap of the coastal hazard assessment module just quickly to make sure that there's sufficient context around what it is that we're going to be looking at today and to help explain how the risks can actually be quantified from looking at these outcomes from the coastal hazard assessments. So this is the overview of the session today. As I just said, we'll go through a coastal hazard assessment recap. We'll look at the vulnerability assessment process and how that leads into the risk evaluation process. And we'll then go through some case examples to consolidate what we've been through and show you how the process works from sort of start to finish. As with all of these CoastWA sessions, there's reference documents that are important to review as part of this process. The two key reference documents for this are obviously the State Coastal Planning Policy, so State Planning Policy 2.6, and then the Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Planning Guidelines. So they give a really good overview of this process and a really useful reference in terms of how you just follow these steps through to give you your overall risk assessment and vulnerability analysis. So from a coastal hazard assessment recap perspective, the key things that we really want to go through are that the coastal hazard assessments are completed separately for erosion and inundation. And one of the key distinctions with this is that coastal erosion is completed based on an event with a 1% AEP. So that's a 1% annual encounter probability, which is otherwise known as a 100-year ARI, or average recurrence interval event. So a key thing out of this is that the event that we use for coastal erosion has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year, or has a 63% chance of occurrence over a 100-year planning horizon. For coastal inundation, we consider an event that has a 0.2% chance of occurrence every year, or the 500-year average recurrence interval event, and that event has an 18% chance of occurrence over a 100-year planning timeframe. So when we look at this, that's a key distinction because we're assessing the risk ultimately, so the likelihood of these events occurring in combination with consequence and vulnerability. So when there's a big difference in the likelihood of the events that we're considering as our design events, we obviously need to take that into account for our assessments. A key thing out of the coastal hazard assessment is that they can be completed for a range of different timeframes, but ultimately has to cover a period of 100 years. So that's the same for what we'll be looking at with the risk evaluation and the vulnerability analysis, is that we need to consider these over a range of different planning horizons to see how these risks may change over time. So the outcome of the coastal erosion hazard assessment is typically a coastal erosion map. So one of these is shown on the presentation on the right. What it basically does is it shows the total area that could be impacted by these coastal erosion hazard allowances over each of the different planning horizons. So simplistically, it's a sum of various allowances. We've got the S1 allowance, which is the risk of severe storm erosion and how much erosion impact there could be on the section of coastline that you're looking at. We have the S2 historic erosion allowance, which is an allowance for continuation of erosion based on observed trends over time. So if your shoreline is eroding at a rate of 0.2 of a metre per year, over 100 years you may need to allow for 0.2 times 100, which is 20 metres of erosion of that shoreline. The S3 allowance is based on the erosion caused by sea level rise, and there's guidelines obviously within the policy which talk about how much allowance for sea level rise you need to account for over your various planning horizons that are being considered. And then there's an allowance for uncertainty on top of that, because as with everything, particularly around the coastline, we don't know everything. We don't know exactly how things are going to respond. So you have to incorporate an allowance for uncertainty just to make sure there's no undue risk. So these allowances are summed together, and then they're typically measured in a landward direction from what's termed the horizontal shoreline datum, which is essentially the line of reference. So in this example here, you can see the horizontal shoreline datum is this black line out the front, and the 2022 or present day erosion line, if you like, is shown in the first line. The second line, which is more of a cyan colour, is 2030. You get back into the green, which is the 2045, and so on through 2070 and 2122. A key thing to note about this is that these are allowances for erosion, but they are not a prediction of future shoreline position. So as we'll get to when we actually talk through the likelihood of events, there's a probability of each of these different factors occurring, but it doesn't mean that in 100 years' time the shoreline will be here, at what's shown in this orange line. So that's a key distinction and just something to remember as we move forward. For coastal inundation, the maps and the plans are basically the outcome of these types of assessments, and what they do is they show the areas that are inundated during each of the different planning horizons. So obviously a key contributor to these differences is the fact that we've got sea level rise changing the potential extent of inundation along the coastline. So looking at this plan here, this greeny sort of teal colour is the potential extent of erosion that would occur in 2015. If we look at the additional sort of cyan colour that's beyond it, that's the additional extent of inundation that could occur to 2040. Then we go further into the more blue colour, that's the additional to 2065, and then so on through the purple to 2090, and then let's call it the lighter purple, whatever the colour is, out to 2115. So that was a very brief recap of the coastal hazard assessment process and the outcomes. What we now want to look at is the vulnerability assessment process itself. So really, as I was saying before, we need to understand the coastal erosion and inundation hazard allowances so that we can properly assess both the likelihood and the consequence, or the exposure and sensitivity of our assets to these coastal hazard impacts. So we assess the likelihood or exposure, we assess the sensitivity and consequence, and what that does is it gives us a potential impact of those coastal hazards on the asset. A key point with this, though, is that you may have a potential impact, but it's not a true vulnerability analysis unless you actually consider the adaptive capacity of the assets as well. So if you've got an asset that is very adaptable to change, then the vulnerability understandably would be lower. If you've got an asset that's not very responsive to change, your vulnerability would be higher. So that's why it's critical to assess the adaptive capacity as part of a vulnerability assessment. This is a little bit different to what's completed in other hazard assessments or risk evaluations, where adaptive capacity can be less significant and often actually isn't completed. So if you're looking at something like a roadway, for instance, or perhaps a drainage network, adaptive capacity obviously sometimes just doesn't fit into that. So this is really specific for a coastal environment where we need to consider adaptive capacity to give us an overall vulnerability rather than just a risk rating. So when completing the coastal vulnerability analysis, it's really important that we're following a process that's going to lead to good whole of agency or whole of organisation outcomes. So as part of that, what I mean is that we need to make sure that we're actually using enterprise risk frameworks or risk assessment matrices which are specific to the local government authority or the organisation that you're actually completing the assessment for. So a key, I guess, example of why that's important is if you say you're looking at, say, maintenance costs or something. If you have a small local government authority, say the Shire of Shark Bay, the budget that they have to work with will be very different to a larger local government such as, say, the City of Wanneroo. So if we were assessing both of those using the same risk assessment framework, the outcomes would be markedly different for each, because one would say that they may have an extensive budget to complete maintenance works or a more extensive budget to complete maintenance works, and the other just doesn't have the budget available. So we need to make sure that we're being specific to the organisation. The other part out of it is that we need to make sure that we are completing these assessments in a way that we're actually able to compare risks across different assets. So this has come up for us a few times where there have been assessments done that have used different risk assessment matrices for coastal assessments, roads, drainage, etc. And what that means is that you may have something that's a high risk in a coastal sense, a medium risk from a road sense, and an extreme risk in a drainage. But because they've all been done based on different matrices, you can't actually relate those to say, okay, well, which is the higher risk out of those? So it's really, really critical that we're making sure that we're trying to provide consistency for each local government in terms of both the quantum of whatever they're able to deal with, say maintenance budgets, etc., and also so that they can compare across different asset classes to mean or to achieve an outcome from these vulnerability assessments that is comparable to other elements across the organisation. So this brings us to the assessment of exposure or likelihood. So it's obviously an assessment of how likely it is that an event will be experienced. So the likelihood depends upon the planning horizon that is being considered. As I said before, the assessment should consider all planning horizons that are relevant out to a period of 100 years. From the coastal hazard assessment and the brief recap that we went through, it's clear that the level of exposure changes over time. So we saw that we had coastal erosion hazard lines that progressed in a landward direction over time, and we saw that we had inundation areas that got larger over time, and specifically, and I guess primarily that's to do with the impact of sea level rise. So we need to look at that exposure and that likelihood, particularly because it is going to change over time due to these changes in sea level, and there can be other factors that have an impact as well. So when we're looking at the likelihood of coastal hazard impacts, we need to consider the fact that it can be caused by a single large event, or it can be caused by the cumulative effects of smaller events occurring over time. I've got a couple of figures here just to highlight a couple of things that are potentially interesting. So if you look at this figure down on the bottom left, you'll see that we've got some instantaneous water levels. So these are maximum peak instantaneous water levels that occur at a certain location. The location is not important. But if you see, we've got each of these different coloured lines with red representing the present day, right through to the cyan colour again, representing the 100-year planning horizon. So what you can see if you look at this is that with this average recurrence interval down on the x-axis down on the bottom, you can see that as we obviously go from a 1-year event to a 1,000-year event, the instantaneous water level increases. So that's not surprising. But when we look at that contribution of sea level rise, you can see that the 1,000-year event in the present day is actually less than what the 1-year event would be in 100 years' time. So this is just looking at water level. This isn't including impacts such as waves and things like that. So it's not to say that in 100 years' time the 1-year event will be worse than the 1,000-year event now, but it's just highlighting that there will be these differences and these changes that will occur over time and that we'll have to account for in our likelihood assessment. Another thing to look at, and this is touching on the point that I made earlier regarding the difference between the 500-year event and the 100-year event, so the 500-year event being for inundation and the 100-year event being for erosion. If we look at the percentage chance of occurrence of those events over a 100-year planning horizon, you can see that there is obviously a change in how likely it is that you will experience one of those events. So when we're looking at erosion, we're getting to the point where we've got 63% chance, as I've said, over the 100-year period. And when we're looking at inundation, we've got about an 18% chance. But you can also go back through each of the different planning horizons that are intermediate to the 100 years, and you can actually assess what that likelihood is. So when we're doing a likelihood assessment, we need to have a scale to assess it against, so a likelihood scale. There are many of these for the presentation today. What I've done is I've taken one that we've used recently, and I guess one of the key things out of this is that I'm going to try and present the scales that we've used, both likelihood, consequence, risk, vulnerability, etc. But I want to take you through some examples along the way to just show how each of these is applied. So in all of them, we're going to talk about what the scale actually is, and then we'll step through some examples in terms of how it is applied, and we'll follow those examples through to the end. So hopefully it helps to sort of consolidate what this process is all about. So as you can see here, we range from rare to almost certain, which is pretty much standard for this type of likelihood assessment. But we can assess it on a range of different factors. We can have it based on the time frame that it could be experienced, the history of occurrence of those events, or probably the more common is the probability of occurrence, because what we're talking about with a coastal hazard risk assessment is, and a coastal hazard analysis is really a probabilistic type assessment. So it's based on statistics. So what I'll focus on today for simplicity is really around the probabilistic, so the probability of occurrence. But I guess I just want to flag that there are other ways to complete these assessments as well. So if we look at what actually has to happen in an erosion perspective, or in an erosion sense, to inform our scale of likelihood, we need to consider the chance of the S1, the storm erosion event, occurring within our planning horizon. We need to consider the chance of the S2 occurring within our planning horizon. We need to consider the chance of S3 occurring within our planning horizon. So there's two factors to that. There's the actual sea level rise itself, and then there's the Bruin rule application of the sea level rise that's required within the policy. So those three things in particular have to or will have different probabilities of occurrence, and what we have to do is try and sum those up and give us an actual indication of how much or how likely it is that they will occur within whichever planning horizon we're considering. The additional allowance for uncertainty, I guess, also needs to be included in that consideration, because it is an additional allowance. So it's something that you have to, I guess, account for when you're actually assessing the likelihood of these things occurring. So to give you these examples of likelihood, so as I said, we're going to step through this example, and we'll step through it for erosion and inundation, and we'll follow it through and take a few little detours along the way to just show you how this process works. So just as a really simplified view, we've got a shoreline and we've got some coastal erosion hazard lines shown there from present day through to 100 years. If we look at a house that's located somewhere around the 50-year coastal erosion hazard line, then what we really need to do is we assess the potential contributions of the S1, the S2, the S3 allowances, and the factor of safety. So our house is located somewhere in that zone. So once we've gone through and we've assessed those I guess the probabilities of each of those things occurring, we can then look at what our overall scale of likelihood is, and we can make our assessment on what that actually, or where that sits. So on this assessment, I'm not going to go through all the details of how we've gone through it from a probabilistic sense, but let's just say for this exercise that we've got a probability of somewhere between 50 and 80%. That means that we end up in the zone of likely over a 100-year planning horizon. I should say that if we were looking at, say, the present day or the 25-year planning horizon, we're obviously outside of those areas of potential impact, so therefore it would likely be a rare scenario. When we start to look at inundation, as I've said, sea level rise has a significant impact on changing inundation risks over time. And what that means, as we looked at with the previous example, is that just in terms of a water level that may occur once every 100 years at present, could occur every year in the future. So what we can do, though, is we can develop plots like shown on the right, and this is an example of a plot for an elevation. So let's say we've got an elevation of 4 meters AHD. This is an example of how the cumulative likelihood of inundation may change over time with sea level rise. So it's obviously there's very little chance of it occurring in the present day in 2024, but as you move forwards across 100 years, then you've got an increased potential for that event to occur. So in this case, if you were looking at it across 100 years, you would say that there's about a 58% chance of occurrence of that elevation that we're talking about. So again, hypothetically 4 meters AHD, then there's a 58% chance that that area would be inundated over that time. So if we go to an example for our assessment of inundation, and we put a house somewhere on here, and we say, okay, well, let's presume that that house was at an elevation of 4 meters AHD, or whatever it is that we want to use, then when we look at our assessment of, or our scale of likelihood, we say that because we're in about 58% here, we're in the likely zone, so therefore the likelihood of this house being impacted over a 100-year planning horizon is actually in the likely category. So having considered likelihood or the exposure, we now need to look at the sensitivity or the consequence of the impacts. So the consequence of coastal hazard impacts need to be assessed across a range of different categories. So this could be the social impact, the environmental, the financial, the reputational. I guess there's many different criteria and categories that need to be considered. Part of this will be informed by the risk enterprise framework for each of the different local or government authorities. As with the likelihood assessment, it's important to note that the consequence of coastal hazard impacts can change over time. So just to give you an example of how and why that is, if we look at, say, this area where there's a house that's flooded, there's one level of consequence that's associated with that. You could hypothesize that there's flooding around the house, but it doesn't look like the house is particularly wet, so therefore the consequence of that level of inundation is quite minor. It may be an inconvenience. If you look at the other end of the scale and something like this, then obviously the consequence associated with something like that is much more significant. You've got full flooding of the house, and likely there's going to be some structural issues as a result, and probably a whole range of other problems, which may mean that the house would actually need to be knocked down or rebuilt. So it's a very different level of consequence to what's shown in the photo on the left. So this is an example consequence scale. If you look across the top, we've got our consequence rating ranging from catastrophic down to insignificant, which is a fairly common scale. And then down the left, we've got our different categories that we're actually assessing this against. So as I mentioned before, there's a range of different categories that need to be considered. We've got, in this particular example, obviously there can be many different categories that each different local government authority will consider, but we've got life and health, we've got business interruption, we've got reputation and consequence, financial impact, and environment and heritage. So what the process is when you're actually looking at one of these is that you actually need to go through and assess the consequence for each asset based on each of these different elements. So you need to assess it for life and health, business interruption, reputation and consequence, etc., and figure out from there which gives you the most severe consequence as a result. And that then becomes the consequence that you actually take with your rating scale. So the examples that we'll run through will give a bit of a better understanding of what that is and why that is and how that actually works. But it is critical that you actually assess it across all of the different relevant criteria. Some may be irrelevant for each asset, but it's important that you do assess it so that you can figure out which is the most severe from a consequence perspective. So to give an example, let's run through our erosion assessment. So we've got this house that we had located behind the 50-year coastal erosion hazard line. When we look at the consequences of coastal hazard impact from erosion on that house, we might look at it from a life and health perspective and say, well, there's really an insignificant risk to life and health. Coastal erosion doesn't happen that fast, so if you can't walk quicker than it, I'd be very surprised. So the risk of injury or illness is actually quite low. Business interruption isn't really relevant because it's a house and there's no business there. If you go through reputation and consequence, there might be a minor impact because there might be some low-profile scrutiny by media or a regulator. I'm yet to see a house that would be impacted by coastal erosion not have some kind of coverage in the media. So there's a risk of that occurring. From a financial perspective, it's a coastal house. Say it's somewhere between $0 to or half to $2 million. And then when we look at the environment and heritage, there's negligible impact. It's a single house. So when we're looking at all of this and we've done our assessment across each of the different categories, we would say that in this situation we'd end up with a minor consequence rating because there are two things that have been ranked as minor. So to follow through with our example on the inundation assessment, let's say that the house that we were talking about previously looks like is shown on that figure. And if we have an inundation event and it ends up with some water in that house, we can obviously make an assessment of the consequence as a result. The consequence of inundation is something that's kind of difficult to necessarily ascertain, but there are some references and things that you can look at to make an assessment of what that impact is. So one of those is some work that was put together by the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. And what they tried to do is look at the depth of inundation and then any current speed associated with that to make an assessment of what kind of damage to property and or risk to life there could be associated with different depths and current speeds. So if we neglect current speeds, which is the x-axis in this particular plot, and just look at the depth of inundation, what we might say is that here, for this particular example, we might have a couple of hundred mils of inundation. And when you look at where that plots on this and the definition that sits, it says that it's generally safe for people, vehicle and buildings. So there'd be some level of inconvenience, but it wouldn't actually be something that would be too significant. So if we relate that to our consequence scale, again, we're looking down, we've got life and health. We would say that we're insignificant. Business interruption is no longer really that significant. Reputation and consequence might not be a significant factor if it's some flooding. There's if things are flooding, there's probably more important things than just someone's house. But we might come down to financial impact. So it's a nice house, you might need to replace the floors. It could easily be more than $500,000, up to say $2 million. And when we look at environment and heritage, that could also be negligible. So when we're looking at this example here, what we would end up with is a minor rating scale. But if we had a case where the inundation was much larger and the inundation depths were deeper, such as this, then we've all of a sudden changed where we actually sit. So when we again review to that plot that's shown on the right, and we're slightly greater than 2 metres of inundation depth, if you read the definition around that, it says that it's unsafe for vehicles and people. All buildings are vulnerable to structural damage. Some less robust building types vulnerable to failure. So relating that to our consequence scale, the risk to life and health, well, if it's a couple of metres deep, there could be a very real risk to life and health. So we could potentially be talking about a fatality if people are stuck in the house, and that would obviously be a catastrophic impact. Going down to the financial impact, it again was a very nice house. Maybe it's in the order of $5 to $8 million if there's structural failure that could occur. And from an environment heritage perspective, maybe it's a medium impact because there might be issues in terms of sewage leaking from sewer vents or the like. So when we assess this, we now end up with the most critical consequence rating is catastrophic due to the risk to life and health. So we end up with, I guess, a difference based on the inundation depth that we're seeing. So we've now assessed the exposure or likelihood, we've assessed the sensitivity and the consequence. We now get to the potential impact. So the potential impact is basically the quantification of the risk, the level of risk, using the outcomes from the likelihood and consequence assessments that we've spoken about. So to do that, you're basically looking at a risk level matrix, which will, as I say, relate the likelihood and the consequence and give you an overall risk rating. So this is a pretty mechanical process whereby you're taking one line from likelihood, one line from consequence, and seeing where it ends up. So with our example from the erosion, we have a likely as the likelihood. For our consequence, we had a minor consequence, which ends up with a moderate level of risk. For our example around inundation, we had a likely consequence, a likely ranking for likelihood. We had two different consequence scales. We had minor for the low level inundation and catastrophic for the high level inundation. So if we look at likely and minor, we end up with a moderate risk rating. But if we look at likely and catastrophic, we end up with an extreme risk rating. Once we've defined the risk, we then need to understand, is that level of risk tolerable, or is it something that we need to do something about? So it's important that we actually, again, look at this and make these assessments based on the risk appetite of the relevant authority, and that's got to be done in consultation with the relevant stakeholders and community. Once again, this risk tolerance level should be applied consistently with tolerance scales used for other assessments and other asset classes, etc., to make sure that you're comparing apples and apples across organisations, can make informed decisions about asset management. So an example risk tolerance scale is shown here. It's pretty common that low risk is generally acceptable. Moderate is generally tolerable, although you're looking to try and reduce that risk wherever possible. And once you get up to high and extreme, they're an intolerable level of risk. And the biggest difference is that basically with extreme, you need to take immediate action, whereas with high risks, you've got a bit of scope. There's immediate to short-term action required to eliminate or reduce the risks to acceptable levels. So if we apply this tolerance scale to our various examples on erosion and inundation, on the erosion side, we had a moderate level of risk, which is tolerable. From the inundation side, we also had a moderate level at a low elevation of inundation, but at a higher elevation, we had an extreme risk. So obviously that's an intolerable level of risk and something that would need to be reviewed. What that shows, though, is that we've actually assessed the risk, but we haven't yet accounted for the adaptive capacity of those assets. So adaptive capacity is the ability of an asset to, or activity, I should say, to adjust or be modified to accommodate the impacts from coastal hazards. So it can be a natural adaptation or it can be through restorative management actions. To give you an example of that, we've got an adaptive capacity scale here. Generally speaking, you're going to have some level of consequence that's almost insignificant. So if you're thinking about the action of a storm on a beach, if there's nothing near the beach and the beach can naturally respond, then you've got an insignificant rating. It might change for a little bit, but it's going to rebound naturally, therefore it's insignificant. You can then carry that through to the other end of the scale, which is a low level of adaptive capacity. So it has little or no ability to absorb coastal hazard impacts, and functionality would be unable to be restored. So the obvious example of that is from the photo on the bottom right, where you've got coastal erosion impacting houses. So a traditional house with a slab on ground is not really able to deal with a high level of erosion, and therefore the adaptive capacity is very low. In between those two bookends, you have a level of adaptive capacity that can range from moderate to very high. An example of that may be a transportable house, such as the figure shown in the middle, where you may have a house that's on wheels, and if there's an erosion event or something, well, maybe you just move the house out of the way. May not be necessarily that simple with connections and sewer and power and all those types of things, but it's something that is obviously better in terms of an adaptive capacity than an actual slab on ground. So you go through and you can work through this scale to assess where those different assets would fit based on their ability to respond naturally or through restorative measures to any kind of coastal erosion or coastal inundation. Following again through with our examples, so from an erosion perspective, if we take our house, and as I've just said, if a house gets impacted by erosion as shown in that image, you've generally got a really low level of adaptive capacity. But what if we had a different scenario? What if that house instead was something like these restaurants that are built on the beach in Amsterdam? So these restaurants are generally put onto the beach in Amsterdam during summer, and they're used during that period. But when the winter comes, they generally load everything back up on trucks and they take it away. So there's an adaptive, management plan that sits around these buildings. And in this scenario, we'd probably be saying that we have a very high level of adaptive capacity because we're actually able to adapt to changes in the beach conditions by picking up those different buildings and moving them off the beach when there is a potential risk. If we look at inundation and we look at our example where we had a high level of inundation, obviously the adaptive capacity to that is very low. So there's little ability to absorb these impacts, and the functionality would probably be unable to be restored because it's likely there'd be some significant building structural issues. But what if we had a different kind of house? What if we had a Queenslander style house where the actual living areas and everything were elevated up above, and the flooding underneath was of less consequence? In this case, we might have a high ability because we might have a reasonable ability to absorb coastal hazard impacts with functionality able to be restored. Natural restoration is obviously not relevant to this particular case. But I guess that shows that we've got to account for adaptive capacity rather than just the simple risk. So when we've got this adaptive capacity, it then allows us to make our assessment of what the overall vulnerability is for the assets. So as I've just said, we're going to combine the potential impact or our level of risk with the adaptive capacity to give us a vulnerability rating for each asset. So the example vulnerability level matrix is shown here. Again, same as for the assessment of the level of risk. You basically have a matrix where you look at one side, so in this case the risk level on the left and the adaptive capacity rating on the top, and you'll determine what your actual rating is based on that. So from our erosion assessment and our house on the beach, we had, under the normal case, a moderate level of risk and a low adaptive capacity, which gave us a moderate level of vulnerability. If we look at the second little scenario that we looked at, where we had these transportable buildings on the beach, well, we now have a very high level of adaptive capacity, which gives us a low vulnerability level. From our assessment of inundation, for our standard or our general sort of house on a slab and a high level of inundation, we had an extreme risk level and our adaptive capacity was low. So our vulnerability was still extreme. If we look at our Queenslander style house, we still have an extreme risk level, but our adaptive capacity is high, and therefore our vulnerability is high. Similar to the risk assessment, we need to look at what the actual vulnerability tolerance scale is. So once again, as I've said, we need to make sure that these tolerance scales are consistent with the scales used by the relevant authority and are consistent across a whole range of different assets so that we can compare apples with apples on the way through. Looking at each of these examples that we've discussed, so from our normal house, standard house on the beach, we've got a moderate vulnerability, and therefore we actually have a level of tolerance to that. For the case of the transportables, this is low and it's an acceptable level of vulnerability. For our inundation, again, of our standard slab on ground house, we have an extreme level of vulnerability, and that's intolerable and needs to be actioned immediately. And for the Queenslander style house, it's a high level of vulnerability. It's also intolerable, but there's short to medium term, immediate to short term action required. So it's not quite as imperative as it is for the other example where the slab is on the ground. That brings us now to the risk evaluation. So this process aims to prioritise risk management measures, and it does that by considering the impacts of the existing controls and then re-evaluating risks once the impacts of the existing controls have been reviewed. Then we can take the updated risk assessment to set a level of priority for each risk treatment. So what are existing controls? Well, there's a range of different existing controls that can be considered. You've got physical controls and you've got planning or management controls. So as an example, the physical controls could include things like coastal structures. You could have coastal management regimes such as sand bypassing, etc. You can then have planning controls. So you've got land uses, you've got time frame restrictions, you've got local planning strategies, etc., that can all manage how the coastline and the area around the coastline is used. You also have emergency procedures such as evacuation plans that can help to manage risk to life, and that can be a key component of the consequence, as we saw in the examples that we worked through. So when we've got our risk and our vulnerability and we're looking at the potential controls, we need to evaluate what the impact of those controls could be, because the controls could affect any or all of the likelihood, the consequence, or the adaptive capacity. But it's critical that the longevity and ongoing commitment to implementation of the controls be considered here, because if you've got a control, let's say a seawall or coastal revetment, and it's in poor condition, it hasn't been maintained for a very long time, and it's about 50 years old, there's no point accounting for that in your assessment and expecting it to provide protection for 100 years' time into the future, because it's not going to happen unless there's some level of ongoing commitment to implement a management strategy or maintenance strategy for that structure. So for that reason, we're only really going to consider controls where they are committed or where there is a commitment to the ongoing management and implementation of that control. So as an example with our erosion risk, if we had, say, a sand bypassing process that was being implemented along this coastline, what that may do is actually change the likelihood by changing where the coastal hazard line sits. If that coastal hazard line now sits in front of the house or seaward of the house that we're talking about, well, then the level of risk is obviously much lower. And rather than being in the likely category, we might now be down in the rare category. So if we follow that through, we were sitting at likely as a likelihood, minor as a consequence, and moderate as a risk. Well, now we sit down at a rare likelihood and a low overall risk. And as a result, if we follow it through to our vulnerability scale, the vulnerability would also be low. If we had another example where we built a seawall in front of the house, well, then the coastal erosion hazard lines may look something like that. So you can see present day, the 25-year and the 50-year. So if we're assessing over a 50-year planning horizon and there's a commitment to maintain that seawall over a 50-year planning horizon, then we're looking at this and we're saying, well, our actual probability now is rare because we're again sitting outside of those coastal erosion hazard lines. So when we assess, our consequence would still be minor, our likelihood is rare. Well, now we have a vulnerability so a risk and vulnerability level that's low. But what if after 50 years that seawall were to disappear? And what if when we assess our coastal hazard line, that 100-year coastal hazard line now actually sits back almost where it originally did? That would be an example then where when we do assess that risk, we're back to our likely scenario, and we end up with a moderate level of risk and a moderate level of vulnerability. So the initial vulnerability in that case, where the seawall is in place, is low, and for a 100-year planning horizon, it increases to moderate. When we look at our evaluation for inundation, again, for our general standard, what if we had a storm surge emergency management plan? So that emergency management plan, it's not going to change the potential likelihood of storm surge being experienced, but what it could do is change the consequence. So if we look at our consequence rating and how we had assessed it previously, we had this level of consequence which was based on a fatality being a potential outcome. But if you've got an emergency management plan that says that everyone's evacuated prior to these events occurring, well, then that risk of fatality is now reduced, and the next level that we're looking at might be a reputation and confidence level, which may reduce this down to minor instead of catastrophic. So when we look at what impact that has to our risk assessment, we've gone from a likelihood, we've got a catastrophic consequence, which was an extreme risk. We're now down to a major consequence, which is a high risk. So our vulnerability in that sense would be high. So the risk and vulnerability tolerance scales should then be used to identify the risks that require treatment. And once we've done that, the level of vulnerability should inform the priority for treatment. So as I've said before, if it's an extreme risk, then it's obviously something that requires an immediate implementation. But if it's at a lower level of risk, then obviously it's less important. But you do need to consider this across the range of different planning horizons to see how these risks change and to define what your level of priority is. So risk treatment options need to also be considered for both erosion and inundation. And you need to note that in different areas, there may be different treatment requirements as a result of erosion or inundation. So looking at our examples here again, we've got our vulnerability tolerance. So you can see where all of the different examples that we're talking about map in terms of the tolerance scale. But if we look at setting priorities of those, we obviously want to work from the more extreme levels down to the lower levels. So the priority number 1 would be around this slab on ground traditional house where there's a high level of inundation. Priority number 2 would be around the Queenslander style house where there's inundation around the base of it. Priority number 3 would be around coastal erosion of a traditional slab on ground house, and there would be no priority for the 4th example of those transportable houses because the level of vulnerability is low and is therefore acceptable. So those examples conclude the assessment of the vulnerability and the risk treatment. I just wanted to again touch on the real key considerations for the assessment. And I know I'm repeating myself here, but hopefully repeating makes it clear of how important it is. But it's crucial that the assessments are completed using matrices that are as close as possible to those used across other disciplines within the relevant authority. We want to be using their risk enterprise frameworks, and we want to be making sure that we are able to compare apples and apples across different, different assets and different asset classes. One other thing that I haven't touched on is that it's important to, and often useful, to complete a sensitivity review to see if small changes can make big differences to the outcomes. Now, often they won't, but if you have different matrices set up in different ways, if you assess something as a minor consequence as opposed to a moderate consequence, then maybe you could end up with very different outcomes. Now, as I said, most of the time that doesn't, but it's important to often review that sensitivity just to make sure that there's not going to be a big change in terms of your management requirements or your outcomes as a result of just the way that it's being interpreted. That being said, consistency in application is absolute key with this. So long as your assessment and ranking methodology is consistent, then the outcomes should be reasonable and they should be relative to each other. So it should help you to understand which areas require your priorities. But I guess as part of what I've mentioned about the sensitivity, it may just scale things up and down. So you consider your sensitivity because it may mean that everything needs to happen slightly more quickly. But as long as you're consistent, the relativity of one asset or the risk to one asset versus another should be correct. The final point here is that the setup of the matrices must be understood to ensure that the outcomes are reasonable and not biased in any way. Now, I'm not talking about deliberately introduced biases, but I'm talking about biases that can occur because of the way that the actual matrices have been set up. So I'll just take you through an example of what I mean by that. So again, if we have an example here, and I've simplified it in terms of some coastal erosion hazard lines on a plan, and we look at, say, a subdivision that occurs just barely in front of the 100-year line, or in this case, it could actually be behind the 100-year line because the matrices make no distinction, as we'll see. So if we look at the likelihood scale, we are going through this. We're certainly not anywhere near the top of the scale based on a coastal erosion hazard assessment and the approach that's been taken. We would say that we're definitely in the rare category. So we have a likelihood of rare. The way that this is applied, we're looking at the consequence, and it's applying it by saying, okay, well, what would be the consequence of these houses being eroded? And when you look at these and read through the various assets of this consequence scale, various elements of these consequence scale, it comes down as severe because it's saying that you've got extensive damage resulting in prolonged period of recovery to property and financial, and that the infrastructure, property or equipment of more than $5 million or 20% of the annual operating budget would be expended. So if we've got a subdivision near the coastline, we're going to be more than $5 million. So that's how that consequence of severe comes about. When we look at the risk rating matrix, we have a rare likelihood and we have a severe consequence, and that gives us a medium risk rating. Looking at the adaptive capacity scale, so going through this, the way that it's assessed is that there's a very low adaptive capacity because these are slab on ground after all, so there's no ability to be able to respond to coastal erosion. That brings us to our vulnerability rating matrix. So if we take a risk rating of medium and an adaptive capacity of very low, we end up with an extreme level of vulnerability. And when we look at our vulnerability tolerance scale, it says that an extreme level of vulnerability is an unacceptable risk. So what we end up with here is that you've got houses that are, for all intents and purposes, meeting the requirements of the state coastal planning policy, and that their setback is sufficient from the coastline, notwithstanding any additional foreshore reserve, etc. But it's saying that it's basically unacceptable to put them there. So I don't think that's the intended outcome of these matrices, but the way that it's applied, or the way that it was applied in the example that this came from, basically means that there is I guess a key issue in that something that meets the policy or very nearly meets the policy is actually unacceptable. So again, just to highlight, it's often worth getting your matrices and just going through a few scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, to make sure that there's not a bias that's going to mean that you're rating anything too high. So that the ratings are too high, and as in this case, suggesting there's extreme risks where there actually probably isn't a risk, and therefore you're not going to be spending your resources looking at the correct items. You want to actually make sure that you're assessing this risk properly, rating everything properly, so that you can focus your energies on the areas that are actually more significant and more at risk or at high level of vulnerability. So I just wanted to run through a couple of case examples now. This example is from the Geraldton Town Centre. So this is work that was completed by Baird. And what we have here is a coastal inundation plot of the Geraldton foreshore and CBD area. So I've circled an area in there in red, which basically shows a commercial development precinct that's along the foreshore of Geraldton. Now, this area is at an elevation of about 2.3 metres AHD, but you can see based on these plots that there's certainly inundation that's likely to happen, that could happen in the event that is being considered in this design event. So one of the neat things that was done in this study is that rather than assess the vulnerabilities by looking at the likelihood scale individually and trying to assess what each different depth or inundation actually meant, they went through and they assessed the almost certain through to rare likelihood scale and gave that an actual water level that was associated with it, again, based on, a statistical analysis. So when we're looking at our area with an elevation of around 2.3 metres AHD, what we can do is we can just assess that against the values that are in the table. So for 2015, we're talking about 2.3. We obviously don't meet possible because possible is 2 metres or less. Unlikely is 2.9 metres or less. So we're fitting in the unlikely side of it there. When we're looking at 2030, again, we're in the unlikely. When we're looking at 2070, well, we're now down to possible. And then 2110, we're also at possible, almost at likely, but we're still in the possible realm. Looking at the consequence scale, so the way that this was assessed was to look at each of the different elements. Looking at economic, it was seen to be a major impact. From environmental was insignificant. Social was moderate. And heritage was also insignificant. So taking the main consequence there, it's being assessed as a major consequence. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this because this is where it's a little bit different to, the general sort of approach that's often taken with these. And by that I mean that the adaptive capacity is being ranked differently based on different levels of inundation. So not to say there's any problem with this, it's a perfectly well thought out solution and approach, but it's just slightly different to the approaches that we've run through in our examples and approaches that have been used elsewhere. The point that I made previously though about consistency, this is the key. So this has been applied in a consistent manner and therefore the outcomes from this assessment are perfectly reasonable and consistent across this study. But what I'm talking about is that basically you have this adaptive capacity ranking, which is low, medium, and high. So they've used a three-level scale. And what they've said here, if you look at these house and commercial premises, they've said for erosion, the adaptive capacity is low. For inundation, the adaptive capacity is moderate. However, if you read the note, it says for houses or commercial buildings with depth of flooding greater than 1 metre over the finished floor level, the adaptive capacity is rated as low. So that's where we're saying, or what they're saying is that you've got two different levels of adaptive capacity. You've got an adaptive capacity of moderate if it's less than 1 metre of flooding, or you've got low capacity if it's greater than 1 metre of flooding. So the other way to assess that may have been to look at it from a consequence perspective and say, okay, well, what's our consequence of inundation if it's less than 1 metre? What's our consequence of inundation if it's greater than 1 metre? And then the adaptive capacity may be the same. There are two different ways of doing it. I would say no one is more correct than the other, but it's just highlighting that there are different approaches. And again, there's no issue with that as long as it is applied consistently and it's well thought out. So where we get to here is that we've got our businesses that we're talking about. So in the corner of Foreshore Drive and Marine Terrace, we've got our inundation consequences that have been assessed. The adaptive capacity here is noted as being low, although in reality it changes from moderate to low. And then we've got these likelihoods that we also assess, so unlikely, possible, and possible. And when we put that all in, so there's a potential impact rating or an initial risk rating, which you can determine from looking at the consequence rating, the potential risk impact rating on the matrix that's on the top left. And then you can get into your adaptive capacity, your vulnerability, which includes your adaptive capacity from looking at this rating on the right. So just to take you through an example of that, if we're considering 2018, we're looking at a major consequence. So major consequence, and we're looking at unlikely. Therefore, we end up with a medium potential impact rating, they've called it here, which is medium. Then if we take that across to our adaptive capacity, we've said that it's a medium potential impact, and in this case our adaptive capacity is actually low as they've assessed it, so therefore we end up with a high risk including adaptive capacity. So that's actually a high vulnerability for that. And you can follow that same process through for each of the different planning horizons to end up with high levels out to 2030, and then for 2070 and 2110 you're at an extreme level of vulnerability. The next example to talk through is just from the city of Stirling and Medham. So this is an example of an assessment that was completed by Stantec. So what we're looking at here, rather than going through all the various different assets, we're just going to look at the parking areas at Saunders Street. So you can see there's a coastal erosion hazard map that's been prepared here, and there's coastal erosion hazard lines that are shown along the draw or in the drawing to just give you an indication of where the coastal erosion risk sits relative, where the coastal erosion hazard lines will determine the risk, where it sits relative to the asset. So this is the likelihood scale that was used for this assessment. You'll see here one of the things that they did is they introduced a near impossible category to the bottom of the scale. This near impossible category is basically there to account for items that are probably outside of the coastal erosion hazard risk area. So rather than just not assessing them or I guess assessing them as rare, which may lead to unintended outcomes, they've put a near impossible so they can really kind of get rid of those assets and not have to give them a risk rating that's going to be potentially erroneous. The other thing that they've done is they've tried to define the level of risk based on, I guess, the positions of the coastal erosion hazard lines. So this plot just shows how they've set it up. They've got the HSD, they've got their present day 2030, 2045, 2070 and 2122 coastal erosion hazard lines, and they've defined the likelihood scale based on each of the areas. So if your asset is between 2070, the 2070 line and the 2122 line, by 2122 they're saying that that's a possible likelihood. So similar to what Baird did with their assessment of inundation, what they've done here is that they've tried to assess the likelihoods of all of the various elements happening, so S1, S2, S3, allowance for uncertainty, and then actually define it here so that it's, I guess, consistent in the way that it's applied for every assessment of every asset that they're looking at. So when we go back to our assessment of likelihood, where that parking area at Saunders Street sits, we end up that 2022 is unlikely, 2030 possible, 2045 likely, 2070 almost certain, and 2120 almost certain. Looking at the consequence scale, so again a fairly standard consequence scale, though noting that it's got environmental, financial, regulatory, OHS, performance objectives, project, reputational, service delivery. It's got all these different criteria that need to be considered. When they've looked at this and they've gone through and completed their assessment, they've found that it comes out as a high level of consequence as the most significant rating. When we look at the risk matrix, we end up with our high level of consequence, as we've said, but our level of, or our likelihood scale actually changes from unlikely through to almost certain. So when we look at that across the ratings for this area, it means that we're starting with a medium level of risk, going through high level of risk, and then into an extreme level of risk from 2070 onwards. Looking at the adaptability or the adaptive capacity ratings, so the way that it's been assessed is that there's a change in adaptive capacity based on the extent of erosion that may occur. So for 2022 and 2030, the adaptive capacity has been ranked as moderate, and that's on the basis that a small amount of adaptive capacity exists. It's difficult but possible to restore functionality through repair and redesign. So what it may be is that it's a car park, but if 3 or 4 bays are lost of that car park, then that doesn't necessarily mean that the car park fails to function anymore. So that's where there's a very justified way that you can say that under those timeframes, it's going to be a moderate level of adaptive capacity, but as we move further forward, we may end up with a low level of adaptive capacity because the impact could be more broad and there's very little of the car park left. So when we look at this, we take our risk ratings, which is shown in the figure down in the bottom left, and when we look at our vulnerability analysis table up on the top right, we end up with a medium level of vulnerability in 2022, and that comes about because we have a medium level of risk and a moderate adaptive capacity, which gives us medium. Going forwards, we end up in 2030, we have a high level of risk and again, moderate level of adaptive capacity, which gives us high. But when we get to 2045, our level of adaptive capacity has now changed to low. So we end up with a high level of risk, but a low adaptive capacity, which gives us very high. And then from there, working through the others, we're already at an extreme level of risk and a low adaptive capacity. So that means that we're at a very high level of vulnerability. So hopefully that all makes sense. As I've said before, the coastal hazard or the coastal hazard risk management and adaptation plan guidelines, the CHARMAP guidelines, provide a really good overview of this process. There are also some brief fact sheets on the CoastWA website to just talk you through the relevant components of this assessment. So hopefully that's helpful if you do have any further questions or queries or chasing any further information. Otherwise, thanks very much for your time, and hopefully that's been helpful in understanding the vulnerability and risk assessment process.